the Strategic Treasurer podcast, your source for interesting Treasury news in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
A frequent source of headache for many treasurers today centers around the adoption of Treasury technology. In this episode of the Treasury Update podcast entitled Managing Your Technology Implementation, Jeffery and Zaubi of Strategic Treasurer discuss common obstacles and areas of confusion for Treasury during typical TMS implementations. They also discuss optimal methods for alleviating the strain of these projects moving forward. Listen in to learn how to make your next or current project run more smoothly.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. My name is Zaubi and I'm joined here by Jeffery, Managing Partner at Strategic Treasurer. Craig, nice to have you with us.
It's always good to be on the Treasury Update podcast with you, Isaac.
So today the focus of our discussion will be on Treasury technology implementations. And while this discussion can sort of be like opening a can of worms, there's just so many topics to cover. We're going to try and focus a bit more specifically on some of the primary challenges that Treasury experiences as the solution is actually being implemented. And also to supplement this discussion, we will be looking at data from some recent surveys of ours that captured responses from corporates that had undergone a technology implementation within the past several years. This data, I think, can be helpful as we frame the discussion around Treasury's primary challenges with these implementations and is certainly relevant. So as we head into the topic, I think it's important for people to get an idea early on of the current state of technology use within the industry. Looking specifically at Treasury management systems, Craig, is there anything you can tell us about what you're witnessing in the current environment?
Yeah, maybe I'll give you a little history on that too, just a little bit of background for the listener. So Treasury systems, particularly Treasury management systems, they used to be called Treasury workstations, sometimes they still are, provided a range of offerings, and they were all installed systems. They were put in the company, run on their hardware, so you'd have a test environment, a production environment, maybe even a development environment, and they were run on separate servers, backed up, supported by the company, so very heavy. When we hit somewhere around 2000, 1999, the first SaaS, they didn't call them SaaS in those days, but the first SaaS systems came out. And by the time we reached 2006, almost all new system sales at the lower end or the simpler end of the scale were software as a service. In other words, they were run on the cloud, they were run on somebody else's server. The updates were done, it was maintained. Somebody else cared about the hardware, they cared about the software updates, and they took off most of the headaches. So that's what happened. And as we've progressed, more and more of this technology has moved to the cloud. And even before the movement to the cloud of treasury management systems, we saw bank services. Banks put out portals, right? They had stuff originally that they would install, they'd bring diskettes, install it in companies. That was great until they had 5,000 customers that had to be updated with diskettes. And then they moved to the cloud before the tech firms. So this has been coming for quite some time in the Treasury space.
Sure. So looking at the current state of Treasury management systems, both use overall in the environment and SaaS systems compared to installed systems, what are you seeing specifically?
Well, what we've seen, so the change that I've been talking about is something we've seen for some time, and we have some specific statistics. So larger companies in particular have.
And when you say larger, what exactly is it? Over $1 billion in revenue? Is it over $2 billion? How would you constitute a larger organization?
$4 billion and up, $2 billion and up, $1 billion up. So when I say large organizations were the ones that bought treasury management systems earlier on when they were installed, that was because the cost, the effort, there was a payoff there. It wouldn't make sense for most $1 billion, $500,000 firms to get those types of systems because the cost was too high. Now, the movement towards SaaS has created a much lower purchase price point and what we would refer to as the democratization of technology. It's a lot less expensive. You can get just what you need. Therefore, the price point can come down at lower levels, so more companies can acquire them.
Sure. Excellent. And just as a point of reference before we move forward, we do have data in front of us that shows at this point in time, roughly 2/3 of respondents to our surveys have a treasury management system other than Excel. That is still split evenly between about half of those had software as a service solution, about half still had an installed system. But as you said, the vast majority of recent sales have been of SaaS solutions. Is that correct?
It is, and so you can see that from the current trends of what's going on. But The replacement obviously takes some time. So when you look at, and we stratified the answers and respondents, and we looked at larger companies, those above $1 billion, for example, and we said, what's the percentage of installed systems that are, or systems that are in use that are installed versions versus SaaS? This most recent survey we had showed that SaaS had just surpassed installed systems. Now it's been multiple years where SaaS has been dominating, but you have a couple decades of people installing it, and the pace of replacing systems and the increased use of treasury management systems it's past the inflection point. So more systems that are out there are SaaS at the larger scale.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that insight. So moving forward now, delving into practitioners' experience with TMS implementations. So it may not be that every treasurer, every treasury staff member has been through an implementation before, which can certainly burden them as they're getting accustomed to the new specifics of their solution, having to account for maybe obstacles that haven't come up. With regards to the actual percentage of practitioners that will go through an implementation in their lifetime, what do you think that number is?
I want to jump back to one of the things that you asked me before you asked this particular question. This was related to the use and the adoption. If we look at the below $1 billion, the change is different. It's about 38%. Almost 4 out of 10 have a TMS. For the smaller organizations, obviously a $1 billion, $750 million isn't particularly small, but in terms of our classification, we're showing that. So 38% have a TMS there, versus about 77% of the larger organizations. But those that have a SaaS on the smaller end are 23% versus 15% installed. So about 50% more organizations have a SaaS system. And this ties into the point about the democratization of treasury. More new systems are being deployed on smaller firms because the technology's there, the payoff is there, and it exists.
And moving forward now to the practitioner experience with TMS implementations we were just discussing. In your experience, when you go into a company that's looking to adopt a new technology solution, are the practitioners that you find there, the treasurer staff, fairly experienced with implementing new technology, or is it usually a new thing for them?
It's usually a new thing. Many people, where they are in their career, how they're progressing through the ranks, may get an opportunity to do it once, maybe twice if they make a move. There's a few people that have done it 3 times, so it's usually they're doing it very limited number of times. Maybe once is the average, or 0.8 might be my guess.
Sure. And these aren't necessarily, you said maybe 1 or 2 times, maybe 3 times over the course of their careers. So if a treasurer has a 30-year career in the industry, that may be an implementation every decade. And none of these implementations will look exactly the same, given the pace of development in the technology landscape. An implementation that they went through, say, in 2005 as opposed to 2015, going to look entirely separate.
That's exactly right. They're going to look very different. They're going to have very different characteristics. The technology is going to have changed dramatically. And so sometimes I hear the phrase, we're looking at the usual suspects. And that sounds great, the most common ones that might fit our particular niche or our size or complexity. But usually when you start talking to people, that means what they remember from their first interface with that. Somebody they saw at the AFP, or they were looking at systems that were all in vogue a decade ago or 15 years. The product may have been discontinued. It may only be on support. It may be gone. And so they're looking at, these are the players, and it's very outdated.
And I think that approach is important to hone in on early on, because we do have data that shows that approximately 4/5 of practitioners have been through an implementation. But as we've pointed out, those implementations may be occurring a decade or so at a time, in between. And as a practitioner heads into a new implementation, a lot of the expectations they have for that are either outdated, they're operating on outdated or incomplete information, and that impacts the roadmaps that they create, the timelines that they create, the way they sell this to the organization. That has, in some cases, a very detrimental impact to their approach just from the beginning.
You're right, and I appreciate the way you expressed it. I think the other item or the other aspect that bears mentioning is it's not just a single piece of software that people need to be concerned about. And we use the term technology stack to use the conceptual elements. What data do we need from banks, from internal systems for forecasting? What do we have to send for payments? So we have data, we have connectivity layer, we have systems, reporting, analytics. When you think about how technology has changed every year, every 5 years, it is a massive upheaval. And if you're only focused on one aspect of it and not in context, you are doing your organization a great disservice because nothing fits together right, or you're not putting in the right type of technology for where things are now and where they're going. You're looking at 5 years old or 10 years old, or you look at things in isolation and they don't work.
And I think that these problems that we're discussing begin to become clearer for practitioners when we are actually examining the differences in time frames. We have some data here that examines practitioners' expectations heading into an implementation versus the reality. So, for instance, we asked them beforehand, how long did you expect your implementation to take versus in reality, how long it actually ended up taking? And the results cast a very interesting light onto how often treasurers underestimate the amount of time that these implementations will take.
I don't know if that's caused by just over-optimism. Certainly there can be some salespeople who push for, this has happened before, someone implemented this in 1 month, 3 months, 5 months, and if everything goes perfect, that's what may take place. But when you're putting in let's say a global system with many, many banks, many connections, you're putting in investment and debt and intercompany banking services, there's a lot to do to test to get it up and running. Usually the team has to do it off the side of their desks. They're not, they have a very full-time job, and then they're supposed to implement a system, run it parallel, make sure it works, and then go live. So it tends to take longer than they expect. Sometimes being over-optimistic, and sometimes you don't get a project through if you say, this might take us, first phase might be 4 months, next phase might be another 4, and it's going to take us a year to 2 years. Most people say, no, we need this in instantly. And so that can also lead to, the over-optimism.
Well, and I certainly understand the need maybe internally as you're attempting to gain support for the project, win approval from key stakeholders, to sort of present the project using the best case scenario or in the best light. But when you look at the results, and I want to hone in on one data point specifically, the number of treasurers who thought beforehand that their implementation would take between 1 and 2 years was 9%. However, in reality, over 1/4, 27% of implementations took between 1 and 2 years. That's over nearly 3 times as many that took that long in actuality as compared to expectations. So clearly there's a very strong gap between what the estimated time frame for completion is compared to the realistic results, let's put it.
Yeah, I think the other side, too, is those that think it'll take 6 months or less. And if you look at the 3 to 6 months category and the less than 3 months, the expectation for both those categories is 45% thought it would take under 6 months. And when you add those two together, it's about 27% is the reality in that time frame, about half. So, your numbers are making sense. It's just either over-optimistic, not realizing all the connections and activity that has to take place, not resourcing it properly. There's a number of things that can create that, but the reality can be very different from the expectations.
Sure, and so I think that's enough with looking at the time frames itself. Once we delve into specific challenges that maybe will cause that delay, the types of obstacles that will add time onto an implementation. We asked, again, practitioners the same thing, what they expected their largest challenges to be compared to the actual results. And there were a number of items, Craig, that I was hoping to get your input on. We can begin with the one that was, I guess we could say, not anticipated to be a large challenge at all, but ended up being one of the largest challenges, and that's communicating effectively with the vendor and with the vendor support teams.
Yeah, project management, the key element of project management is communication, making sure people are staying on task, making sure issues are bubbled up, communicating and staying aligned saves a lot of wasted effort. And effective communication within your individual group is easier than when you get to other parties. And this can be, your support teams in IT and accounting, et cetera, but it also can be with the vendor, their connectivity group, the the person who's running project management, maybe even the lead implementation. So regular, effective communication is easy to say, it's hard to do. And, there's also the situation when a company has problems or is hitting a delay, there can be a tendency to want to point blame at someone else or the other. When that happens, people tense up and they may not, address things head on and keep working through it. And so there might be an additional delay, which is just exacerbating a negative situation to make it more negative and then adding time.
Sure. And I think it's important to note here that there are several vendors in the space that have built out very large support teams that can, onboard new clients pretty easily. They have bandwidth to support that, but there may be some others, and practitioners may not realize the gap to which some vendors may only have 1 or 2 project managers, only a couple support staff, whereas others may have dozens on standby. Evaluating, I suppose, the vendor's ability to onboard you at the onset is worth taking a look at.
Yeah, and I think some context for that might be in order as well. The last 5 years, the commitment or the expectation to invest significantly in treasury systems has been highly elevated to extremely highly elevated. And you're talking more than 40% of firms now expect to spend significantly on treasury technology. Now, not all that may be TMSs, but what we have seen in the last 5 years is tremendous spend in the area, accelerating spend, maybe not to the level that they were expecting, but certainly it's been highly elevated. Technology firms can't necessarily staff up as quickly as was expected. And several firms took a hit 5 or 6 years ago, in particular, where everything accelerated very rapidly. And you have, people are dealing with 10 or 12 implementations at once. You can't make everyone happy. Now, that's a significant challenge. But many of those that experience really rapid growth have created different approaches, more teams, different tools to help with that. So they've expanded and they've been able to adapt. So we're in a better position overall on the implementation side, particularly with the vendors that have been most successful in ramping up their sales. Their service organization, their implementation organization has followed behind the other, but it has followed and has played better catch up.
Sure. And that all makes sense. Thank you for framing that. Another challenge that I wanted to pique your brain on is bank onboarding. And this is something that we have a lot of practitioners that we've discussed with over the past year or so have pointed to bank onboarding as being a source of considerable headache for them over the course of either a treasury aggregator implementation or a TMS implementation that involves a lot of connectivity to banks, bank portals, and the like. What do you see as being some of the main challenges with regards to bank onboarding that really bog treasurers down? You
may not remember, but I remember the old Lotus 123, the earlier versions, like some of the old software.
It's a bit before my time.
Yeah, so maybe I'm trying to think of what it is, but you would hit there would be a blank matrix, and you'd have to hit a slash bar to bring up a screen before it was useful. Well, any system, it has to have some kind of data to act upon. You have to set up the referential or structural data to make it make sense. But you also have to have transactional data in a treasury system to make it make sense. So you can start a TMS, and if you don't have all your bank accounts reporting the details and the summary information, you really can't do a lot because that's core, your cash positioning, and then from that your forecast. You load all that information. So if you buy a system and you don't have your connectivity in there, you have nothing in there to act upon, so you can't build things out. So it's a very early item that needs to be solved in a treasury management system. So that's a bit of a background. And someday I'll show you what 123 was.
Sure. And I look forward to it.
But the other piece on that, to your question of why is it so difficult is, one, you are connecting, you're figuring out some way to connect to a bank. You're needing to decide what's the format. How are you going to get that reported? Is it going to be a host-to-host connection? You're going to go through Swift? Are you going to use an aggregator? Are you going to use the connectivity within the system? Are you going to use the connection options that they're providing on an outsourced basis? You have to share information, make sure it comes in, it gets tested, it gets loaded properly, and your back-end elements of the system configuration are set up properly. People overlook that. Oh, it's so easy. You send a letter and the bank reports it. Well, there are some times when that happens. Most of the time, you need to hang on these and drive them drive it until it's all the way in. It's not as involved as making payments, setting up wires or ACH or other types of payments, making those type of connections, because that's more complex. But people overlook that. And there's different formats that are more common over the globe. Some people can only support older fixed length or delimited formats. Others can use the current ones. So each of those represents touch points that have to be pursued vigorously to get it done. And not everyone focuses on that.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up that point, because another one of the challenges that we listed here was transitioning from the old to the new solution. And I don't think a lot of practitioners really realize how much complexity is involved with this step until they start to look at the specifics, the specific types of financial messages and all of the regional variations in those, the different types of bank connectivity options that you have available, the different type of back office connections that you have to have established between your ERP and your TMS, whatever other systems you're using. Once you start to set up those connections and test them, you realize that there are a lot more problems that can occur than what you originally anticipated.
You are so right. We get used to apps that are so easy to set up. You program what language you want, and the stuff just works very quickly. It's the API world, if you will. Things work very quickly and do exactly what you want. It's very templated, very bulletproof. A lot of this is not. There's new formats. They're coming from various systems within a bank, and there's a level of security you need to have that's very different from your map application on your smartphone. So it is easy to make decisions that may or may not make sense for your organization. Let's just take formats, for example. Oh, I'm used to BAI2. I'm from the U.S., for example. I'm familiar with how it looks, the 88 record, which is the detail record. I can see what kind of transaction 475 is. It tells me it's checks paid or whatever the information is. It's comma delimited. It has a fair bit of good information. Maybe you're comfortable with that, and that might be very useful to you. Maybe you're in Europe and you're familiar with the message type, or MT940, which has information coming across. You very much understand the pages in that format, and you're used to integrating that with your TMS or your reconciliation platform. Both of those are very much old formats. They've been around for a very long time. They will be around for a very long time. They may have information you need in them, or you may want more, but people are used to that. Now you have to contrast that a bit with some of the newer formats, like an XML format, a camped message, for example. An XML format is not delimited or broken up by commas, where the position of the transaction amount is number 5, and that it's the transaction amount because it's in that 5th position. It has tags front and back, so it says tran amount and tran amount on the front and back within the curly brackets. So your system can determine what it is because it tells you what it is. You're not determining what it is based upon place. And why does that matter? You may want enriched information, additional information coming across. So if someone's familiar with BAI2 and says, I really need to know what the BAI code is to tell me this is checks paid, because I'm going to do accounting off of that, and that information is very useful and very easy to help me create my accounting. It's very useful and easy to help me determine where that goes in my cash position worksheet, because I can define it based upon that code. And maybe you have that or don't have that in an MT message type. And then if you move to the new format, you say, why do I need a new format? Not all my banks support an XML version, an ISO 20022 type format. And you can say, it would be nice if there were enriched information, but my bank only sends me the same stuff. And if I don't specifically ask for them to enrich it with a BAI code so that there's a reference thing that says BAI code, I'm going to have data that's less useful than my older style formats. So I think there's a couple things there. One is understanding that there are different formats. The new formats are enriched. They can have more information, but the banks have to put that information in there, and you might have to ask for it. They don't all volunteer it. And the second is that more data, more useful data, can be included there for other uses like reconciliation or some kind of posting or matching that exists. So there is a greater potential for value in that. I know we got very deep in the weeds here on on the data, but when you're thinking about the transformation of formats, the older BAI2 and the MT messages are really old formats. They were designed when you had baud modems that passed hardly any data across at all. So the expense factor was how many positions came across. That was very costly. You grew up in a time, we have 100 meg up and download speeds at our house, right? And that was...
Sure. And I'm pampered, I get that. But I do think that was a perfect example for demonstrating how something as seemingly simple as just changing a bank format in context is actually very, very complicated. There are very specific items that have to be taken care of carefully, or else you're going to experience problems with data being exchanged properly, maybe getting the wrong message fields, maybe getting incomplete message fields on your information, which can have a massively awful impact if that's not taken care of properly at the offset of the transition, let's say.
Yeah, and let me try to summarize that mess of a running monologue that I had there. Is when you think about things like formats, you want to use the more modern formats or the more modern technology, but you have to leverage it properly. Just because something's newer won't make it better by itself. Whether you're talking about XML or you're talking about API formats, application programming interface, where you can just attach to a bank system, pull data back when you need it or when you have a long-term process. So how you handle your connectivity and the data factors into how your company will succeed going forward. You don't want to put in old stuff today and then have to rip it out 5, 10, or 15 years to take advantage of enriched activity.
Sure. And thank you for providing that clarity. There's one other challenge that I wanted to touch base on before we move forward, and that's the hurdle, I guess, of training new users on the solution or training existing users on how to use the new technology that you're implementing. This can be a larger problem than anticipated because, as we've said already, the new technology is not always the same. As the old solutions, there's a lot of upgrades and updates that go into the course of a new solution, whether it be a new cloud solution or you're adopting new functionalities. There's a new type of interface you have to get accustomed to. There are all types of specific items that must be cataloged and for lack of a better word, educated the practitioners on before.
Yeah, I think the point that you're bringing up about the training users, I think there's two things. Let's talk about the system and the training of users. A system has to be updated, right? If you had an installed solution, why did some of them lose value? Is people decided not to do an upgrade because it was a lot of work. And they said, there's nothing in here that we need. They skip it. The next one, they don't have anything they need. The next one's going to take too much work. They put it off. Then people move, and 4 years later, you have an obsolete system. You have to go. You're two major numbers behind. You have to do a re-implementation, basically, or do 6 consecutive implementations. They didn't keep track of the system. They didn't continue to invest in it, so they let this asset become a declining asset. Some of that aspect is done away with SaaS systems because they're automatically or by design improved and implemented. On the people side, we have to think as treasury professionals for the organization, not for ourselves. Sometimes people love the idea of if I hoard this knowledge myself, I'm safe, I'm protected, and that can be a problem. So the knowledge of use of the system should be well shared. But here's a couple examples of where you can run into a problem. An organization has a training program. They rotate people through different areas of finance, and some of them rotate through treasury. Well, someone comes in, they're doing a 6-month rotation in treasury. They learn 60% of what the system does. They move off. But when they have an overlap, they're training the next person. They learn 60% of that. Next thing you know, people don't know how the system works, or any change happens. They stop. They run into a problem. The stuff's entered into a spreadsheet. And within a few years, they're using 20, 30% of a system, and everything else is back to spreadsheets because they didn't intentionally make sure the human element stayed current, stayed up.
And I'm glad you brought up that point because we have another data set in front of us here looking at how much available TMS functionality practitioners purchased that they ultimately ended up using. And the results are not what you might think. In fact, only 40% of companies are using between 80 up to 100% of the functionality, which means nearly 2/3 are using less than 80% of the functionality they purchased, which is not an incredibly cost-effective option when you're talking about maybe a six-figure sum, maybe even a seven-figure sum for an implementation.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So those examples I gave are ways that the system can fall off. Another is that some components may not work. They didn't work as planned or as promised. And then there's also this rush is when you rush to buy a system, you can usually get the best price in other modules that you intend to use. And so you're buying all these extra modules, and then you end up implementing 60% of phase 1 that you thought you would, and you push stuff off to phase 2. Maybe you do phase 2, you never get to phase 3, and so you don't implement things. So between some systems and modules not working, other elements not being implemented, people moving and losing track, there's a huge fall-off rate here in terms of how much of a system that was purchased is actually used in reality.
Sure. So, Craig, we've covered a lot today in this discussion, and I think we're close to wrapping up. But before we do so, I wanted to ask you if there was any advice you could give to an organization that's about to undergo an implementation. What would your word of advice be?
If you're about to take on an implementation of a treasury management system or something else, I might say before you did that, you should make sure you understand what your technology stack needs to look like to support the overall objectives of the firm and how Treasury is going to help that. One aspect of that is, do you have a modern technology stack that incorporates what the company's doing and also reflects the need of Treasury to be very nimble and fast-paced? And so if you select a system within that context, then everything you're doing builds towards the future, towards better use, a better value of your investment. If you're doing things in isolation, you might think, hey, I'm moving quick. Quick is good. This is the right way to go. And I think moving quickly but thoughtfully is the best way, because you don't want to have to retrace your steps, yank out things later. That is a massive waste of time, a massive issue for companies. And they end up not doing more. So then they're running stuff on spreadsheets because they lost this opportunity.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Craig, for sharing your thoughts with us today, and that concludes our episode. We hope everyone listening found this discussion helpful, and we thank you for tuning in. I do want to just note very quickly that if you'd like further information regarding the data points we discussed, they are being made available via a link on the podcast page of our website. If you just navigate to our podcast homepage, click on this episode, you should see a link to a resource that will provide you with access to that information. So with that, thanks again for listening. Be sure to check back often for new episodes and content, and have a great day. Thanks, Craig.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. We invite you to follow our updates on Twitter under the username StratTreasurer.